Welcome to the Grace Story Podcast, where inspiring stories are brought to life. This podcast is made possible by Grace College and Seminary, located on the shores of Winona Lake in the great state of Indiana. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Flam. This is the Grace Story Podcast. Today on the podcast, we have Darren and Stacy Gagnon. Darren and Stacy met at junior college in Arizona and then transferred to Grace, looking for a school where they could finish their education and play some sports. They have 7 kids: Bailey, Silas, Isaac, Ellie, Joel, Israel, and Zori, and their family story became a national inspiration after a blog post from Stacey went viral, and their family was featured on the Today Show in 2017. Since then, Stacey and Darren launched Lost Sparrows, Inc. Lost Sparrows is dedicated to improving the lives of orphans and those with special needs through education, proper medical care, and adoption, and currently focus in areas in Eastern Europe and Bulgaria. There's so much more to the story than that, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. So why don't we jump right in? Darren and Stacy, thank you for being with us on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
I have not had the honor of meeting you before, but I've gotten to know your son Israel a little bit because he's in the same classroom as my son Jaden, and I must say he has one of the best smiles I have ever seen, and just a joy whenever he smiles from across the room. So, and he is one of your, how many adopted children?
5.
5 of 7, just a small little group there that you have going. So take us back to Arizona a few years ago when you guys met. Tell us a little bit about your time there, and then how in the world did you decide to pick up and move to northern Indiana?
Yeah. So in the 90s, when both of us were from similar towns close by each other, we ended up at the same junior college.
Very late 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. We won't say any years. So we met at the junior college. Stacey was playing volleyball. I was playing basketball, so we ran the same circles. We ran into each other, started dating our freshman year, and then so knew we needed to transfer a year later, right, end of our sophomore year, and both of us wanted to go to a Christian school. So we were looking for somewhere to go. Never had heard of Grace College, had no idea, So, but Stacy's roommate was headed this way, was coming to Grace College. She had been from Phoenix and was from a Grace Brethren church. And so through those conversations, Stacey found out about Grace College, and then both of us ended up getting scholarships and coming out for a couple of years.
So both of you played volleyball and then basketball here as well at Grace.
Correct.
Awesome. And what were your majors at Grace?
Education.
Okay.
And biology.
Now, what's funny is you've sort of like switched, right? So you did education, but Stacey, now you're in more of the medical side of things, right?
Correct. So now I went back because one of us needed to make money because teachers don't make a lot. And so I went back and I got my RN after that.
And you started in biology, but now teach here locally at Warsaw High School.
Yeah, I taught got into teaching so that I could coach high school basketball. And then that's just, teaching's been such a great career for being a family guy.
Awesome. Yeah, you just decided to have your own basketball team amongst your family there.
We're working on a baseball team, apparently.
So tell me a little bit of your story. How did God lay on your heart adoption, and then adoption especially of some kids with special circumstances? How did he lay that on your heart as a couple?
Not gently. I laugh because if you would have asked me how many children I wanted when I was at Grace, the number was 0. I was not. I wanted a career. I think being an athlete, and I was just incredibly driven, and I wanted to have a high-powered career in some way. And so we had 2 children, which were such a blessing, Bailey and Silas, and I was teaching in the school district, and I saw this need for homes for children that were in foster care. And I just said, well, we could have a foster kid in our home, and that was kind of the end of that story. We started fostering and ended up doing medical foster kids because our oldest had been born with a cardiac condition. And so we were pretty well versed in running medical stuff. And I wouldn't say that we started out with a heart for special needs or adoption in general. It was just almost like there's a need. I think we can maybe fill it. And that was kind of, I think the rest is history as far as that.
Wow. So your kids have come from different places. Tell us domestic adoptions, international. How does that break out amongst the five that you have?
So our middle three, they were what are called medically fragile foster children. So they all came to us with some pretty extreme medical needs. Medically fragile, when it's within the system, means that a typical foster home is not equipped to handle a child with those needs. And so we dealt with feeding tubes and oxygen and vents and cardiac meds and all kinds of crazy stuff in our home. And so our three middle children were adopted as medically fragile children. And then our two youngest children are adopted from Bulgaria.
And in the process of that, when you started adopting from Bulgaria is when you started telling your story a little bit more. You started with a blog, right? Ransom for Israel. Tell us a little bit about that name and even that outlet as a blog, as a way to tell a little bit of your story.
Interestingly, I've never thought of myself as a writer. I thought probably my mom only read anything that I would have ever written. I will tell you that Israel and our adoption of Israel completely destroyed my life, and not in the way that you think sounds ugly. In the way that who I was before Israel is not who I am now. I again was still very driven. I felt like I could achieve and fix anything. That if I set my mind to something, that I could make it right. And so Israel had come across my Facebook feed. And so I'm like, Darren, we should go adopt this little boy, because if not, he's going to end up in an adult mental institution. And in my mind, I was achievement driven at the time. Like, okay, I can go and I can fix this. I can fix this wrong that's being done. And there was one moment of time, and this is when the blog kind of started, was I went to visit him the first time. You make 2 trips. And so the first visit, I walked into the orphanage, and it's this stone building that's like crumbling. And there's 300 children housed there, and it's silent in there. And I just remember thinking, how is it so quiet in a building with all these kids? And they bring me into this room, and they bring Israel to me, and I was like horrified. I didn't want to hold him. He was like skeletal, and he was broken and smelled bad, and his teeth were all bad, and he kind of was screeching because he didn't have any language. He was 4.5 and didn't have language. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I cannot do this. Like, I can't, like, and I wanted to run away. And so I went back to the hotel that night, and I literally got on my knees and I said, God, please, I cannot do this. Like, I'm going to destroy my family. I can't bring home this feral kid because I can't fix this. And I had to go back the next day. And when I went back, they told me that I couldn't visit him in the visitation room. They needed to take me back to his room. And I knew. I'm like, oh God, you're going to make me see something. And they took me back down these steps, down to this basement almost area, and these metal doors. And above the metal doors was this sign. And I said, what's that sign say? And it says the section of the malformations. So he was in the section of the malformations. And they walk down this hall, and he's by himself in a crib, and he's tied into the crib, and he's just rocking. And I sat there for 2 hours, and there's like glass walls, so I can see other children. But he sat there for 2 hours just rocking, and all these other kids were rocking and banging their heads on walls and just like drooling. And I'm like, it was the most horrifying scene I'd ever seen in my life that just destroyed me. Like, it was like God just said, you're going to see what I need you to see. And then it got worse. They came in, they said, we heard that you are a nurse. We want you to come with us to see something. And I walked to follow them, and I didn't want to go. And I followed them to this back room, and there's bed after bed of babies that were dying. And I thought, oh God, like, they are babies that are dying. And so I automatically kind of went into the nurse mode, and I walk over and I'm like, okay, this child needs this, and here this needs this, baby needs this. And then the translator was like, Stacey, they want you to stop. They're not here for you to fix them. These babies are here to die, but they need the NG tubes. They need suction tubes. They're using the same tubing on every baby. And I just left that day and recognized how far driven into my performance in my safe suburban bubble and in my safe life I had become, that I had failed to see such a greater, bigger picture. And at that point, I started writing, and I started praying that God would use me and take me to places and let me be a voice for kids that had no voice. Mm. And that was like the start of that. Every time we go to another country, we find ourselves, or I find myself, taken to rooms that no one's allowed to see. And I just feel like that was what drove Ransom for Israel, was just the stories and being a voice for the voiceless.
How would you express the change God did in you? You were performance-driven, accomplish-driven, felt like you could fix things. How would you express that God changed you to who you are today?
My whole life has been about earning God's love. If I do this, or I do enough, or if I'm good enough, then I'm going to earn something. And this has helped me recognize that there's nothing, my works or my deeds are filthy rags. And, my greatest fear in bringing Israel home was having a child that I would have to be diapering and caring for when he's 30 and 40 and 50. And now I laugh at that, because Israel probably will live with me when he's 30 and 40 and 50. And I feel like it's an honor and a blessing and a gift, because God has just changed what I have come to value in life, and has changed what my definition of success is. My definition of success now is obedience, and being obedient each day to what God's called me to do, instead of being obedient to the call of the world and what the world tells me is success.
Darren, you weren't on that first trip, correct? So your wife comes back, and you start to have an understanding of what life's going to become like, and this blessing that you have. How did God change you, or how are you being shaped during that time as well?
Yeah. Stacey and I think we make a pretty good match in this sense. Like, her fears and the things that she struggles with aren't the same as the ones that I do. So we kind of complement each other in that sense. And, I felt like that was a hard thing, that when she called me from Bulgaria, and I'm like, well, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I'm thousands of miles away, and I can't do anything, right? As men, we tend to be fixers, right? I want to fix it. So I think through that process, just a lot of emotional processing of, how's this going to look? What are we going to do? We knew God asked us to do it. And that was I just kind of had to go back to that. Like, if God asked us to do it, then we need to do it. And that obedience factor, right? Like, it was what he called us to. And so we had to trust that he would work out the rest of the details. He'd worked out all the other details in the adoption, the fundraising of thousands and thousands of dollars, and all the support, and all that he had taken care of. And now we're at that point where it's like, and so when we were fostering, there's a lot of fear, right? The phone rings, and you're like, I don't know what's on the other end of that line. Like, are they? And so through that, we just decided, we didn't ever want to make decisions based on fear, because it's antithetical to what we feel like is our faith. And so we just said, God, if that phone rings, we're going to say yes. That's it. And doesn't matter what, we're not going to ask any detail. We would want to know information, but not to decide yes or no. Like, Any kid, if you want them to come to our home, we're going to say yes. And so we kind of went back to that, like, this is the one child on the planet. How did we end up with this one? Well, obviously we felt like the Lord directed us to him. And so now, hindsight, you look back and like you said, he's the most happiest, joy-filled, smiliest kid. He's such a blessing. But there's that initial fear. And I think a lot of that is natural. We just have our own fears. And then, in so many circumstances, when you're trying to be obedient, the enemy tells you he will bring up the fear. And so we just, again, went back to saying, okay, well, you told us you're going to take care of it. So you better come through, because, if you don't come through, we're in big trouble.
You not only became obviously advocates for your own kids and caring for them, but started to use the outlets God had given you to become a voice for the voiceless. And that led to a Facebook post that I'm sure you didn't have planned would go viral, and ends up with you on the Today Show. And tell us a little bit about the circumstances behind the Facebook post and why you think it became national news, what you expressed and why you expressed it.
We had gone to a new church on a Sunday. Our oldest son was presenting with the youth group. And so I had walked my middle son back to the children's church, just like any parent would. And just as a little background, my middle son, Joel, has what is called golden hair syndrome, which is he's missing portions of his face and his ear. So he definitely looks very different. And so I had walked him into children's church, and when we walked through the doors, every child in the children's church stopped talking, started looking at him, pointing at him, and then whispering to each other. And I watched my kid, like, it was almost like normally in that circumstance, I would have stepped in and started teaching these kids about differences. But it was like I just stepped back and I looked at my son, and he completely just melted he looked just like the saddest thing you've ever seen, ran to the back of the room and put his head in his arms on a table. And I was just so disappointed. And so I walked back and I said to him, "Do you want to sit with me in church?" And he said, "Yes." And so he sat with me in church and he held my hand and he took a pen and he wrote on my hand, "Joel loves mom." And I was so sad for him, because to have a facial difference, everyone looks at faces every day. And to always just be stared at or whispered at, I felt like I just was disappointed. And so I had written a post that just said, "Please teach your kids about differences. Teach your children that they will see people in wheelchairs. They will see people of different color. They will see people with walkers. They will see people with out an ear or without an arm or without a leg." Show them. We have the beautiful World Wide Web and the ability to show our kids pictures of people that are different. Because if we don't prepare our kids, then what happens is kids get stared at and whispered about and pointed at. And so I had written that, and it just went, viral, which was not something that I intended. I just intended to educate parents.
So important.
Right.
And to let our kids know that, everyone is made in God's image, and everyone is important. And how do we teach them the value of the individual? And so you end up then with the opportunity to express that message, on the Today Show.
Yeah.
There's not a bigger microphone. There might have been a few more people listening that day than will watch this, maybe just a few. So, you get that opportunity, and tell us about what you're feeling when you get this call about hey, come to the Today Show and share this story around the world.
Well, first of all, they asked if I would bring all my kids, and I laughed and said no. I can't imagine managing all my children on stage for the whole world. But no, it was very, very surreal. I think. I mean, that's just not a world that we travel in or live within, and so nerve wracking. I mean, but Megyn Kelly was super down to earth and very nice. And I think from that, what was really cool is we ended up writing a children's book that was published and did pretty well, called Cowboy Joel and the Wild Wild West, and it's set for kids. And he got to be a huge part of it, and that was really neat to be able to do. But yeah, I think it kind of launched us into having a little bit of a message and being able to, what we believe is that every child has worth in this world. And, and that's the premise of everything that we try and do, even with Lost Sparrows.
And you started Lost Sparrows then not long after. Tell us, like, what is Lost Sparrows? What's your overall mission, and how do you carry that mission out?
Yeah, so after we adopted Israel, talking with lots of friends and stuff, and even I want to say in the process getting ready to adopt, we didn't know what God, after she went back to nursing school, we kind of didn't know what was the right next answer for us. And so there was a video that we had seen. I don't know who shared that with us, but it's a video by Eric Ludy. It's called Depraved Indifference. And it's just an amazing sort of a motivational little short clip. And so, we kind of watch it. It talks about adoption, about how this is such a need that's there. And so it kind of helped motivate us and solidify in our mind. We felt like God kind of used it just to talk to us a little bit and say, this is really what I want you to do. And so then after we get Israel home and our eyes were opened. So in the video, he talks about the idea that depraved indifference, once your eyes are open to a problem, you can't ignore it, right? You can't just keep going about your everyday life and pretend that you don't know. And so we felt like we needed to do something. But, what do you do? How do you change countries across the globe? And how do you think this is a huge problem? There's 6 million orphans or something, in the world, like there's so many. And so we, with some friends, with some support of some really good friends back in Arizona, started Lost Sparrows. And the goal was like, okay, well, we're, again, not sure how God's going to use it, but we got to try to do something. And we have some contacts in Bulgaria that we work with and still work with that have helped us to do a lot of neat things there. But so then the first year or so, that's where we spent our time, was in Bulgaria. And then since then, some other doors have opened. We have some really good friends that are in Bosnia. They're in Sarajevo. And so we have expanded there. And into last April, Stacey was in Moscow. I think she was gone 21 days on that trip straight. I mean, it was a lot. And so juggling 7 kids, 5 special needs kids, trying to have both of us have a job, and Lost Sparrows, like it's a lot. But we know God had called us to do it. So he's equipped us, he's given us the talents, and he's provided financially in a lot of ways for us to do some amazing things. But it's just our way to see how we can provide homes and families for those kids that are stuck in those orphanages.
Now, beyond working with orphanages and kids and hopefully getting them into homes where they can have the proper care, you've become educators as well, doing your own conferences and sessions and then going and speaking elsewhere. Tell us a little bit about, what you get to do now out on the road and what's the message you're trying to get across to families.
Absolutely. So what's beautiful is Lost Sparrows is education in the States as well. I feel like when you start working with kids and you're looking at trauma in the life of kids and adoption and foster care and all these things, we should no longer be looking at geographical lines, any of those things. And so what we teach in the U.S. is what we do in Russia, in the Philippines, and in Bulgaria and Bosnia and all those places. We are working to equip foster families and families to take care of children that have been exposed to hard things. We also are doing what we call supporting first families, which is the best thing is that a child never leave their first family. And so we aren't supporting orphanages. We're supporting first families, and we're supporting children to be taken from orphanages and placed into family. And in the United States, the education that we do is supporting families in working with kids that have come from hard things, but also, working within the jail system, I'm working with first families, working with bio families, I'm working with first families. And so Lost Sparrows is, yes, international, but we're also do a lot of things here. And so we do a lot of trainings and things that through Los Sparrows here.
And you talked a little bit before we started the podcast about, neuroscience and just all the things that you have learned. And if you have just a few minutes, which we have on this podcast, to really educate somebody on, hey, this is what trauma is, and this is what it does. And, regardless of who you are, here's a little snippet of at least what you need to know and understand as you interact with others. What would you say?
So I would say that I feel like even for me, the one lie that I believed was that kids were resilient. I truly believed that kids could bounce back from things and it not change them. And what we teach is the understanding that starting in utero, that children, when they are exposed to things that are traumatic or they are moved out of their stress response window, it actually changes and alters the brain. And then what we see, whether it's in the classroom or in our home, is a maladaptive response to stress. And so in the classroom, you see children who don't respond to rewards and punishments. You see children that maybe look ADHD and we want to medicate them, or we see children that are dissociated and we can't figure out why they're daydreaming all the time. In our home, those are our kids that are just out of control and I don't know what's wrong with this kid. And so what I've recognized and what we try and teach is what's the science behind that? How do we foster relationship, and how do we manipulate environment to support kids whose brains have been changed from early childhood experiences to be able to be successful as they grow?
Yeah, and what I would add would be that parents, if any parents that are really frustrated by their experience of trying to work with kids and it's not going well, like we hear a lot of stories from a lot of parents. We talk to them all the time. It's really frustrating when you don't have an answer, right? You're trying to raise a kid that has problems that you don't have the solution to. And what I would say is there is an answer, that it is that we do now know a lot more. Human behavior is really predictable. And so if you're one of those parents that's really frustrated and struggling, there are answers. You gotta know where to find them. And so like our training classes that we do, through a lot of different resources, I'm not saying it's easy to find them, but the answers and solutions are out there. You gotta navigate through all those things to find them. But I just know there's a lot of really frustrated parents who are at the end of their rope, sort of like not knowing how to proceed. And so I would just encourage them to start reading. They can learn a lot. Like that's kind of how we did. Through experience, and then reading books by Bruce Perry and Karen Purvis and Brian Post and Vander Kolk's book, all those, like you can educate yourself on, and it will make a huge difference in the way you interact with your kids.
Mm-hmm. Stacey, you just returned from Bosnia and Croatia, is that right?
Yes.
Give us sort of, you take these trips, but give us kind of what did you do there? Like what did a typical day look like? So we know, really what does it look like when you go on one of these trips to one of these Eastern European countries?
Wow, it's a typical day as you hit the ground running and then you fall into your bed at night. But, this last trip was a big planning trip. We have a huge conference rolling out in April that we'll be teaching at, where we're expecting probably 500 people in
over
that
there
country.
in Europe?
Yep,
Okay.
in Europe, coming. And we're actually getting scholarshiped in over 200 foster families because they're starting to roll that out. So part of that conference, though, was meeting with ministry officials and inviting them to be on a panel because we want to drive policy change. I'm a big preventionist, and so I want to not just be only boots on the ground. I want to try and drive policy because I can look at the big picture in this country and recognize, like, okay, wow, it's an option for me to place my child in an orphanage and just make a phone call every 6 months and they can stay there till they're 18. Okay, that's not a good policy. Let's talk about a policy change. Let's talk about foster parents being allowed to adopt their foster children. All of these are policy changes that you can help educate and work alongside of politicians there. The other thing that we did is that we we believe in stopping the flood of babies into orphanages in the first place, and they have an exorbitant number of special needs children that are placed in orphanages because at birth, most moms are told you will not be capable of raising this child. And so we did a really large dinner for special needs moms. Because 70% of women are raising their children on their own because at birth, basically the dad says, if you're keeping the baby, I'm leaving. So we did a huge dinner where we spoiled the heck out of these moms and just, breathed life into them saying, look, we see you, keep doing this. We're here to help you. We're here to stand behind you. And so they're also helping drive policy change for children with special needs and adults with special needs. And then I also went to I got to speak at a large gathering or forum with World Without Orphans, which there were 8 countries represented, and talking about what Los Sparrows is doing and looking at spreading across the Balkans trauma-informed care and trauma-informed parenting. And that's what our conference will be about. It's all about understanding trauma in the brain. And so that's in a nutshell kind of the time there. So
it's amazing in just these few short minutes to hear the many places God's taken you, as you've just said. Yes, we're not sure what's on the other side of this yes, but we're going to say yes. And as someone who has adopted, I'm thankful for those who have assisted in bringing information to the rest of us. So thank you so much for what you're doing. And, at Grace College, we want our grads to go out and live purpose-filled lives. And we have a specific meaning for that. It's not just, go make more money or go be famous. It's go make a difference. And so you are a great example of that. So thank you for not only what you do behind the scenes that we don't ever see, but also thank you for being willing to share a little bit of your story with us today. What's the best way for people to be able to connect and to find you?
If you go on lossparrows.org, you can see a lot of what we're doing. Also, you can follow us on Facebook. We have a Los Sparrows page. And then I also have a personal page that I share a lot of the stuff that I write, and it's under Stacey Jackson Gagnon. So, that's definitely, I think, a way. Oh, one other thing. We have a lot of our trainings have been put out through a website called traumalenscare.org. The lens is LENS. And so those are free training videos that Arizona has contracted us to do.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for being here with us today and sharing your story.
Well, we appreciated our time at Grace. We definitely were shaped by many incredible instructors and also our coaches.
Yep, absolutely. In fact, one of our professors that did premarital counseling told us we shouldn't get married. So that's one of our things. I was thinking back to that, and we were like, you guys are not a good fit for each other. That's what we were told. So that always is a good story from our time at Grace. But Grace was instrumental in us becoming who
You should listen to most of what your professors say, but maybe not everything, is what the lesson is. Good. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for listening to the Grace Story podcast. Our music was written and produced by Dr. Wally Brath, Assistant Professor of Worship Arts at Grace College, and thanks to Andrew Palladino and Rick Neer, our co-producers. And if you can do us a huge favor, please rate or comment on this wherever you retrieved it from, and we'd be so grateful. Until next time, live your best Grace story today.